Thank you very much for credentialing me with this arts-oriented crowd. And the one thing I would add to your introduction, Ellen, thank you, is that my wife Laura and I have had for over a decade donor-advised funds at the Minneapolis Foundation. It's incredibly convenient to use and makes us feel like we are harnessing our giving, which is focused on the arts, to this philanthropic community that the Minneapolis Foundation is at the center of. So we have today heads of, or very senior executives at, 4 of the most important arts organizations in Minneapolis. And we're going to listen to them talk for 30 minutes and leave about 15 to 20 minutes for any questions that you have in the audience. And I'll just introduce them much more briefly than Ellen introduced me, so we have time to listen to their thoughts and ideas. But to my immediate left is Joe Haj, who is the director of the Guthrie Theater. He's been serving in that role for 2.5 years, and he joined from the Playmakers Repertory Company in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Next to him is Faye Price, who is co-artistic producing director of Pillsbury House Theater, a role she's played since 2000. Then Kevin Smith took over as the president of the Minnesota Orchestra 3 years ago after a 30-year career running Minnesota Opera. And then Christopher Stevens is the chief of advancement at the Walker, where he's worked since 1994. So we have performing, music, visual arts represented on the panel today. And what we wanted to do initially was have a conversation about challenges, opportunities, trends, issues in the art world, but that would be boiling the ocean. We have less than an hour to do that. So we thought we'd focus on an issue that is critically important. It's not the only issue that's critically important in the arts world, but it's an issue that is critically important in the arts world. And that's the whole issue of diversity, inclusion. You could expand it to race, cultural appropriation. And these are all issues obviously playing out with us a lot of energy and creating a lot of turmoil in society today. And not surprisingly, given the role arts plays, the arts play, they are playing out, those issues are playing out in the arts world. So we're going to focus on that. And what I'd like each of the panelists to do initially is talk about the challenges and the opportunities those issues are creating in their organizations and how they are steering and navigating their organization in this time of, as Ellen mentioned up front, this time of disruption. So Joe, let's start with you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning.
And if you would move, I've been instructed to tell you to move the microphone close to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, yeah. Well, I guess let's start with what the challenge is. You know, many of our larger, and I'll obviously focus on theaters, which is the discipline that I know best. I can't speak for other large arts organizations outside of the theater field. But in the theater, certainly in the American theater, our institutions are simply far behind when it comes to matters of equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's just a fact. And it's measurable. It's measurable in our numbers. It's measurable in who we hire. It's measurable in our programming. So there are, you know, we describe it. Equity, diversity, and inclusion has found its way as a core value into the Guthrie's work. And as such, it becomes a lens through which we see all of our work. And there are systemic biases, and we believe that systemic biases deserve and need systemic solutions. So we have structuralized a lot of our work around ED&I, which has led to some really great outcomes. We can maybe talk a little bit about that later. The challenge is enormous when you have an organization as the Guthrie that has operated in a certain way for a half century. And so how you shift that culture, how you make sure that as you are diversifying that workforce, that you can retain outstanding staff, that folks who have historically worked in the organization in one way also feel safe and taken care of inside an organization that is moving in a new direction. And those challenges are, of course, real. A shifting culture, even if we all can agree that it is affirmative, that it is good, it nevertheless results in incredible internal churn inside an organization. So change is hard, even when it's demonstrably positive. And one of the challenges of being in this space is how we get comfortable in the discomfort of this ED&I work. Studies show the happiest cultures are indeed homogeneous ones. So how do we trade the maybe minor feeling that is happiness for an organization that is in fact equitable, that has people with very different points of view at the table wrestling with some of the same questions? How do we make ourselves comfortable inside that discomfort is much of the near-term and I suspect long-term challenge of being in this space.
Thank you. Faye.
Good morning, everybody. So Pillsbury House, I often don't quite know what to say, and I am asked a lot to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, and I often don't know what to say because, you know, one of these things is not like the other, and I think we walk our talk. My organization was founded by an African-American theater practitioner. There are 2 female artistic director heads, myself and a white woman, Noelle Raymond. And in our DNA, we're the 21st century equivalent, if you will, of the settlement house movement kind of theater, where we're direct descendants of the Hull House players, for those of you who are familiar with the settlement house movement. Todd London, one of the bright thinkers in American theater right now, talks about how the American theater was actually founded in the Hull House players and their notion of immigrant theater, and how all of these various voices and various peoples came in, and the Italians at the turn of the century did their Italian great playwrights, and the Irish came in and did their great playwrights. And somewhere along the way, it changed. And we at Pillsbury House are firm believers that the community deserves its voice. Okay, that's enough about Pillsbury House. What I want to say about the diversity issue is that what we're finding, one of the challenges, because the theater has changed so much, is that, you know, there used to be, for example, in this town alone, there were 2 gay lesbian theaters that have now folded, if not more. I can think of 2 that have now folded. There are African-American theaters all over the country that have folded, with the wonderful exception of Penumbra, which is still alive and well, and I'm a company member there. And a lot of this has been attributed to the fact that wonderful larger institutions are now being able to do that work. They're doing plays written by African-Americans. They're doing plays specifically written by gay folks for a gay audience. And so one of the challenges is, how can we keep doing this good work when it's not being made available to us? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Okay, well, first of all, welcome. Welcome to Orchestra Hall. Welcome to the Target Atrium, and especially welcome to all of you who love and support the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. They are great colleagues, great colleagues of ours, and we love them. But that's for the St. Paul Foundation, too. You know, the Minnesota Orchestra has been here since 1903. And, you know, when we think about long history, the symphony orchestra has been around for, you know, close to 400 years. And over those hundreds of years, over those centuries, the symphony orchestra has been refined to such an exquisite extent that to get 90, 100 musicians together on any given moment and on a given evening with all the music and all the preparation and everything is a science. And it's been refined to such a degree that we are experts in it. But the problem is that, by being so exquisite and so expert, we tend to be rather narrow in how we think about and how we do things, and very process-driven. In other words, it takes a huge institution to put on an orchestra concert and to put on particularly a world-class orchestra concert on a consistent basis. So that's been our basic mission. But and since 1903, of course, everything has changed, and it constantly changes. And in order to stay relevant, we had a board member recently say that if in a changing environment, if you want to be relevant, you can change, or you can change the environment, and guess which you have more control over. And so we are in a very dramatically changing environment. And I think the issue of diversity and inclusion is a big factor now in a variety of ways, socioeconomically, culturally. I think the whole idea of identifying ourselves as community is caught up in this. And as an invention of European culture, the Minnesota Orchestra, we have, as I understand, I've only been here for 3 years, but for years and years, we've been aware of these things, and sort of like, how do you deal with it? And it seemed like such a huge monumental issue that people almost didn't know where to start. And so we have been very active, as all of our colleague organizations have been very active, as long as I've been here with the orchestra, and even before when I was with the opera. But in the last few years, we've all worked hard. We've done a lot of diversity and inclusion training. We have really begun to experiment with different ways, programmatically, institutionally, to address this. And I will say, like Joe said, that diversity, inclusion, serving a broad community, actually, let me take that back, not serving, collaborating with a broad community is a high priority for us institutionally. But what makes this institution drive, what makes it work or not work, really isn't the board or the staff, it's the musicians. And it took me a while to figure that out. I think that kind of came through also in our infamous troubles period, as we call it, the lockout. But the fact is that it's really all about the musicians. And the musicians, from a philosophical point of view, are wide open to all of this. But in a practical sense, there's a lot of new territory. So I just want to make, there are a number of people here who will understand this because they were there. We went to Cuba in 2015. And one of the things that we did, which we typically wouldn't do on tour, is our musicians did a rehearsal with the Havana or the Cuban Youth Orchestra. And Osmo was conducting, and it's a side-by-side rehearsal. So our cellist sits next to one of these cellists. So the orchestra's twice the size, and it was great. I think they were working on Tchaikovsky. I can't remember exactly what it was. And then after a while, their music director came, and we rehearsed a Cuban piece. And I can't remember the rhythm, but it was it had some sort of syncopation, like bump, 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 bump. And of course, we can do that, but we couldn't do that, really. And so what happened is that the whole thing reversed, and the students started taking over, and they were instructing our musicians. And very clearly and very openly, and it took a little while, but all of a sudden, and then the light bulb went off. And so now we have been able to, as we've interacted with a variety of different cultural communities, we've found that it's the music, it's the art itself that is the basis of growing community and collaborating. It's really about making music, not just sort of trying to share what we do with others. And I think, and this doesn't mean that you make huge strides every day, but we are making, I think, very real strides. And that's, I think, cause for optimism, at least within the world I live in.
I think most of you obviously know where the Walker Arts Center is and know we're contemporary in focus, but strangely our institution actually began in 1879 when our founder opened his home, which was on the location of the State Theater on Hennepin Avenue, close by, and you would literally ring the doorbell and come in and see his art collection. So we have a long, long history in this community of showing art, and I would say the diversity, equity, and inclusion focus became very paramount with us. A number of years ago, we screened the film 12 Years a Slave, which was by the filmmaker Steve McQueen, who happened to be a video artist before he made feature-length films, and he was an artist that the Walker had purchased works of very early in his career, supported him early in his career. And when that film came out, before it won Academy Awards, and we were able to convince him to come to Minnesota to do a screening of it and talk about it, because of course he felt like we were an artistic institution that was an early champion of his work before he became more famous. And so we had him come, and we have a small cinema that seats 350 people, and of course it sold out very quickly, and it sold out largely to, almost exclusively, to our wealthy white donors. And we were very heavily criticized at that time about saying, how can you bring in such a topical thing with such a preeminent filmmaker on such an important issue that our society look at, and not be more inclusive about who you're letting to be part of that conversation? And that was a painful thing to be called on the carpet on. And our director, Olga Wiesel, felt strongly then, you know, we do have some serious blind spots, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is a value that she holds dearly, and she really thought it would be helpful if the large cultural institutions, at the same time the Ordway was getting critiqued for Miss Saigon, other cultural institutions, I won't even name them all and what was happening, other large ones were justifiably being kind of taken to task about some of the exclusivity. And so we've banded together to create this Twin Cities large cultural organizations where we're pooling resources and time and talent and trying to collectively look at how do we make our boards more diverse, how do we make our staffs more diverse, and how do we make our audiences more diverse, because we realize it's an issue that we all face as large organizations, and it's something that we think. So for example, now we do throughout the year numbers of diversity trainings where all the employees from the various organizations come together and do DEI work, and there's subgroups doing good work. And I think that's was an important start to what we need to do, both individually as institutions and collectively. And then I would add to that, even when you have a mindset of making that a real institutional priority, you're still, as in the Walker's case, capable of making horrific mistakes and things that you really regret, in opening wounds and creating painful conversations in the community that probably were necessary conversations that could have been had in much more inclusive ways. So even as you're trying your best to do better and think about it, it can feel like a big step backwards sometimes, and that's all the more reason why this work is really urgent. It's why we need to continue to put financial resources and staff resources and focus to make sure that we're really trying to make our audiences, our staff, and our program as diverse as the community that we live in.
So Christopher, you alluded at the end there to the scaffold incident at the Walker. And that issue is nationally, maybe internationally, sort of the poster child for a set of issues that sit alongside but are a little different, related to but different to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the terms being used are art and appropriation, race and representation, sensitivity or censorship. At the heart of it, and I think, Faye, you put some words maybe in my mouth, the question is, to what extent does an artist, or do artists from one culture have the right to produce art about another culture, and what needs to happen in that whole process? Walker went through that. Any comments or learnings about that? You're not alone in facing this issue. All arts organizations are facing it, but you were at ground zero in many ways in 2017.
I mean, we're doing an internal review. We've brought in help to do that, to really think carefully about what we can learn from it. So it's a little early to say, but personally, the fact that if you're going to put a provocative work of art by someone of one race about the stories of a group of other races, the minimum you would need to do is have a lot of dialogue in advance of doing that. To me, that's the minimum. And then, even then, some people will be still unhappy. But we didn't do that, so that was clearly a huge mistake where we could have, even before purchasing that sculpture, we could have consulted with lots of people, had them see the piece, asked what people's opinion was. I mean, that piece was in a public park, which makes it different. It wasn't in the Walker Galleries. I mean, we do a lot of challenging work at the Walker Art Center. You know, it's our mission, and we follow artists who often do challenging work. A public park setting's a little bit changes the story and kind of lens we should have brought to that. And clearly, it was an example where there weren't enough internal checks and balances to say, we may think this work of art is a critique of capital punishment, which is what the artist stated, but there are other people that felt like that was our story and it wasn't your story to tell. And ultimately, that artist, after spending a lot of time with the Dakota elders afterwards, regretted it. He personally said, I felt like I took someone's ancestors' bones or sacred artifacts and they weren't mine to take, and now I will give them back the Dakota people. So for the artist, it was a painful learning thing. Although I don't, to be honest, that piece was shown in Europe before hundreds of thousands of people, where places like Amnesty International and others embraced it as a critique of America's obsession with capital punishment. So he didn't make that work of art to come to Minnesota thinking that it would be in this community. So I actually have great, I don't hold the artist responsible in the way I hold the Walker responsible for what we didn't do in advance.
Panelists, any, sir?
Yeah. I just want to make the point that there's huge sensitivity and complications here. And you do, as we've talked about this as a group, sometimes you quote unquote step in it. And sometimes, there's a certain risk involved what you do. But when it comes to the issue of cultural appropriation, I want to be possibly a little provocative here.
Good. By the way, if any of you feel like you need to say something or ask something, please just put up your hand and show us that you want to be part of this. Go ahead. Sorry, Kevin.
We appropriate culture freely as human beings. I mean, that's what we do. If you look at what our culture is now, it's a combination of a variety of different cultures. I was recently in South Africa, and you go to a township and you see a bunch of people wearing New York Yankee caps, and you think of the Silk Road project of Yo-Yo Ma's, and you think, really there's a whole series of interaction where you find out that in Norway they just found, Syrian artifacts. And that's what we do, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so I think that in the extreme ideological perspective, I think the idea that people own their culture and nobody else has right or access to it, I just think whether it's right or wrong, it's just not the way the world works. It's not the way we work as humans. At the same time, I think, as Christopher points out, that I think we're very much more aware as the world has changed, and in many ways through communication we've gotten more homogenous or more driven by, let's say, American culture or commercial cultural ideas, that it means that everyone has been very more thoughtful and protective and maybe appreciative of ethnic cultural roots and things like that. But when I really just think that if the arts community is supposed to leave Asian art to an Asian arts organization, for example, or if an Asian arts organization can't do European art or any of that stuff, that doesn't work for me. I mean, I just think that you've got to respect the artists, you've got to respect everybody, but that's really one of the exciting things in this world. When I was just talking about sharing culture on a Cuban basis or the African American community, we're doing a lot of work right now. That's terrific, and that's wonderful, and we all gain from that. I wasn't that provocative, I'm sorry.
That was Minnesota's version of provocative.
Yeah, well, okay. I didn't see everybody getting all hot and bothered.
Well, no, we don't like to get hot and bothered. So, Joe or Faye, you want to pick up on any of that?
I would just suggest that, Kevin, I don't disagree with you. Hello? All things being equal, hey, there I am. All things being equal, in an ideal world where there's great equality, I think that's a fine idea. I think where we get into trouble is, I'm looking at you, I really don't need to look at you. But this is, where we get into trouble is because the world is unequal and there are folks that are more powerful. And if the folks that are in power start to appropriate the culture from those that are not in power, then that's where we get into trouble, because it doesn't go both ways. It doesn't go both ways in funding. It doesn't go both ways in terms of, for me, in theater casting. I'm losing a lot of my actors of color because I don't have the money to be able to pay them what they're due, most definitely. And they're, they want to work with us, and they consider Pillsbury House or Penumbra their home theater, but we're not able to pay them what they are owed. So again, it has to do with the power dynamics for me. Things are not equal, and when the more powerful are appropriating the less powerful, then that's where it becomes an issue.
So, Faye, I'm sorry, Joe, when you and I talked, go ahead. I cut you off, Joe. Please, go ahead.
No, I guess I would say, so I guess we should define terms. Appropriation, I think, is a loaded word, is a challenging word, not an inappropriate one, but I think we should probably define terms, because I think of the Guthrie making more opportunity for some of those very artists you describe as making opportunity. And I think if an organization at the size and scale and resource of the Guthrie is not meaningfully offering those resources in the direction of populations, of artists, of administrators who haven't had that sort of access or opportunity, this is, it's so difficult, and it's lurching, difficult work, and you feel that you're always failing in it, or at least we do, but we're hopefully failing forward. But in the end, it's fairly simple for me. Are we making more opportunity or less? Some of the very quarters that were most critical of the Guthrie in 2013, when you, as you were talking about, a difficult year for many of the big organizations that led to the founding of this Tickle-Cough group.
The world's worst acronym.
No
Tickle-Cough is this
question.
group focused on diversity and inclusion in the arts. Sorry.
I just think, the Guthrie has to be a lot of things for a lot of people. And if we say, for example, Asian American work belongs to MU, and African American work belongs to Penumbra, belongs to Pillsbury. Children's theater, family theater belongs to the Children's Theater. Musical theater belongs to Latte Da. Then the Guthrie, with its extraordinary resources, are only making A.R. Gurney plays. It's only the Gin Game. That's all that's left. And I'm not that interested in those plays. So even while we know, I sometimes use the New York Museum analogy. If you go to the Whitney in New York, you're looking at American art. If you go to MoCA, you're looking at contemporary art. The Guthrie needs to be, in my view, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. If you want an Impressionist painting, there it is. If you want a Rothko, there it is. If you want the remains of a mummified cat, there they are. That's who we have to be, even with the foreknowledge that if somebody is especially interested in Van Gogh, there is a museum where one can go and know everything about Van Gogh. But for me, I think we have to be careful of not be seen to be either outsourcing our work on diversity, not expecting, well, there are others in this space, so we have a free pass to step aside from those conversations. Our view is that we have to be involved, and we have to be making these plays, because we're a classics theater. We make many of the important plays in the American and European canon. Those are not all white artists who make those plays. We need to be celebrating all of those artists and putting the Guthrie's resources in order to deliver them. And again, I think good people can disagree on the approach. But that's ours. I mean, in the end, we think that more opportunity is better than less opportunity. And there are folks who have been underrepresented in the Guthrie's world, and making room for them has become important to us.
You have a couple of questions in the back.
Phil Schultz, Vocal Lessons. Thanks for the conversation. So you mentioned defining terms. I would say let's look at curating versus appropriation. And I want you to respond to, I think appropriation is when you engage in other cultures' art without meaningfully connecting with folks from that community. That's appropriation to me, when you make artistic choices and decisions in a silo. Curating is when you engage meaningfully people from that community and bring them into the process. So I'm curious about each of your organizations, how you're going down that route in the equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I also haven't heard you mention access. And I'm curious at some point if we get to the access part of the conversation as well.
Thank you. Panel?
I hear movement down here.
We're about to open on Friday an exhibition called Adios Utopia about Cuban art from 1950 to the present, a big retrospective. And of course, the Cuban community in the United States have mixed feelings about the history of Cuba and that country. And rather than just opening that exhibition, we did bring together a lot of people from that community to tell us how they felt about it, and heard a lot of different points of view. That some were concerned the exhibition would be too celebratory of the socialist revolution, from which their families lost everything and were forced to flee here, and others felt like the revolution was the greatest thing ever, and that we want a celebratory show, and that, we're hoping that exhibition's a more nuanced view. Perhaps it'll make no one happy in that way, and maybe that's the right way to do it. But I do think we had we put in some hours and some time convening, talking, listening, and made sure that people felt heard about what, and helped outline expectations and gave people insider's view. So we won't just open the door on Friday and wonder what people will think. We've already engaged, and I think we're committed to doing that a lot. We've done that for many, many projects for many years. We didn't do it with Scaffold, I said, but it is something that we need to do really regularly and authentically, and put serious energy and time to do it.
I just want to get back to that kind of charged term appropriation and clarify what I was trying to say before. We take other cultural information and use it as we choose. I'm not suggesting, this isn't a moral judgment, that's just what we do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we learn from other cultures, we gain from other cultures. As arts institutions, this is a whole different ballgame. And we have a very challenging, a big challenge to understand what that means in our context. And what you hear from these panelists up here, and I think any of you who are associated with arts organizations would say that there's a tremendous amount of time and effort and thought put into what you do and how you do it. And one of the wonderful changes that I'm seeing more and more, I hear the optimist again, and that is that, for example, what we do as an orchestra, if we're getting out of our kind of narrow box, as I defined it earlier, we're talking to a lot of people and interacting with a lot of people and sharing a lot of ideas and developing ideas before we do that. And we're very thoughtful and careful, and even sometimes we misstep. But that's our responsibility, and I know that this arts community understands that responsibility. And whether we do it right or whether we do it wrong, we are very sincere in wanting to understand and appreciate and respect all of the other, the ethnic complexities and the cultural complexities within the arts community and with the broad community. And I think we should really be proud of that. There's a lot of work to do, obviously, and it's not like, oh well, check that one off the list. This is a big ongoing issue. But once again, I really see more than I ever have in the approximately 40 years I've been in the arts community. I've really seen this community, the arts community, and the major arts organizations really take this on in a very new and different, meaningful way. Please.
Can I just quickly, I don't want to forget your question about access. One of the things that we do, so we're talking about the audience and who comes and how do we make the theater accessible. We have been doing pay what you want for, I don't know, about 7 years now. We did it as an experiment at first to see, well, what happens if we just say, suggest a donation $25, but let's pay what you can or pay what you want. And we actually ended up making more money that way, ironically. And so we have just kept it up as a practice. So what started as an experiment with one show is that's what we charge for all of our main stage shows. Because we feel like it's important for people to be able to come to the theater if they don't have money, to feel like that this too belongs to them, that they can be a part of this exciting thing that happens under this roof. The other thing that makes us accessible is free parking. I have to say that. Whenever I'm invited to meetings and I'm like, can you come over to our place? Because you don't have to pay to park. And it makes a difference.
Thank you. Sarah Sternberger with Free Arts Minnesota. I want to get back to something that, Faye, you said earlier, and Joe, you had some comments too. I'm a small A arts organization. Most of you on stage are large A. And my perspective is, Joe, how you talked about creating opportunity. At whose expense, though? Because as a large A organization that is still viewing the world through a relatively white board and white donors, as your organizations, large organizations, are enlightened now around equity and inclusion, I worry that the large A organizations are sucking the money away from organizations that have already been culturally relevant, like Penumbra, like Pillsbury House, like Theater Mu. How do you collectively, as part of the arts world in our Twin Cities, work to make sure that we don't lose some of our small, culturally relevant organizations at the expense of your work around equity and inclusion?
I find it hard to find a plausible argument between the Guthrie becoming more diverse than it has been historically and that driving other theaters out of business. It's a scarcity mentality. The Guthrie, the flagship organization in any city, in any discipline, anywhere you go, will always be seen as the organization that is absorbing resources, the most resources out of community. The Guthrie being better in this space, I think, makes the community better in this space. It attracts more of the artists that we're all interested in. It describes I think it describes a landscape where we understand as a group that we all value these matters of primacy around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think having the Guthrie in that space is valuable for many of the, to use your term, small A arts organizations that have been arguing for that space historically, arguing that that's what we need it to be. And I will say that there are many of those very theaters that have been arguing that that's what the Guthrie needs to be for a really long time. And so we can have a lot of conversations around a lot of things, but I can't accept an argument that makes us less than our best selves in this space. That's my obligation. I didn't come to the Guthrie and get interested in this question. That's been an interest of mine in my entire leadership career. I've worked hard on it everywhere I've ever been, and before that I worked hard on it as a freelance artist. It's the world that we want. It's the artistic community that we want, and the Guthrie cannot sit it out. Yes, we have to be good citizens in this landscape, and yes, we need to move the needle for ourselves meaningfully. That's my view.
Now that was a little provocative, which is good. You had a question?
Okay.
If you could just tell us who you are.
Sure. Again, I'm Jared Hanks, and I'm with Juxtaposition Arts. So to your point about access and the issue of large organizations and small organizations and the like dynamic nature between the two, we see, say, the Guthrie working with Juxta right now, right? So one way that the Guthrie is working with Juxta is they hire us to do their design work. And so we're sharing culture in that way and sharing resources in that way. So I think that's a good example in terms of how organizations can work together. But also, my question is, in terms of access, we're talking a lot about, diversity and inclusion in terms of the artists that we're bringing in and the people that we hire. But I want to know about the leadership and the boards and who's in these meetings and who's in the rooms making these decisions. Even now that we can see it represented on the stage, right? There's 4 white men and then 1, African-American woman. So like, how do we create more equity and diversity in the large arts organizations in the leadership realm? Because that's going to inform the decisions that get made, when there's a scaffold situation, right? That you'll be able to have those insights more so on the front end. So I want to hear, are you guys thinking about that? How are you guys approaching that? And how do we move forward?
Again, just to clarify terms, I'm non-white, so assumptions. Yeah, we're working, we have, the Guthrie has structuralized some of these changes. Every search at the Guthrie for every position we're looking for remains open until we have seen in person a diverse and qualified slate of candidates. And that has changed our outcomes meaningfully. Since I started in 2015, we've hired 28 new people. 28% of those people have been people of color. When it comes to artists on stage, 15% of our actors were actors of color in 2015, 37% are actors of color today. Creative teams, first conversation I have with the director is there's no such thing as homogenous creative teams at the Guthrie anymore. No more all white, all male designers, director, choreographer, music directors. That has to be a plural group, that has to be a diverse group. We moved from 11% people of color on our creative teams to 36% people of color on our creative teams in the last 2 years. We increased our female, gender's a big issue as well, and we increased our female creative team members from 18% to 39%. So again, if you want to change, you have to just actually change. And yeah, we can spend, there's so many things that you need to move slowly on, and you need to study, and then you need to study the feasibility and study again, and then sometimes you just have to go. And we've made the decision to just go at the Guthrie. And I want to acknowledge that that creates challenges. I get that it creates challenges, I really do. But for me and the senior team, which is 40% people of color, the senior leadership team at the Guthrie, the going fast and doing it lurchingly seems to make better sense to us than going slow and trying to do it perfectly and knowing that we will never get there.
Our staff is as diverse as a small staff can possibly be. Our board I want to talk about, because I'm, again, part of a larger social service agency, Pillsbury United Communities. My executive leadership for the past 10 years has been African American female, who is now at the Minneapolis Foundation. Thank you, RT.
Speaking of soaking up resources.
I didn't say that, he did. Replaced with an African-American male who's still with us, as of today at least. And our board is a wonderfully diverse group of people that are a part of an organization that really care about the Twin Cities in total?
I was just going to say, I agree that it's super important, again, that board, complexions of board change, and there's a lot of power that resides in boards. And part of this coalition is, I thought we are committed to having 20% of every board being diverse, which is more closely mirroring the state's demographics. And in fact, in the Walker, there's some Walker trustees here that we put a lot of energy in the last 3 years, really seeking out great candidates. And our board now is 20% people of color, which is a huge change from 1879 till today. So, and the board, I think the board realizes that, well, we're super aware that the demographics of this state, so it's at our peril that we don't have staff that reflect what our population is. It's at our peril that we don't have boards and people in power that reflect the demographics. So it's a sincere commitment to make those changes, and important.
I don't have percentages, but I can say that we've made some very good progress. And one of the ways that has been most prominent is, you probably know that we have a very Finnish music director, and we've introduced a great amount of Finnish repertoire to our community. We have 3 other people on our conducting staff. One of them is African American, and it has a huge impact. It has had a huge impact in this community. Another one is Japanese American, and the other one, both of them are Japanese Americans. So we have 2 women, 1 white guy, 1 black guy. On paper we look great. If you look at the orchestra, we are very well represented by women and Asian population because the classical performing arts have gotten very big in Asia. Where we are almost completely unrepresented is with African American musicians, and to that degree, we've now started a fellowship program that is really, really making a difference. And we have what we call pipeline issues. By the time you get to the Minnesota Orchestra, you're kind of like in the NFL if you're a football player. It's really an elite thing. And so everybody says, well, we'd love to be diverse. All we need are the candidates. Well, you can't just sort of sit around and wait for the public school system or whatever to address all these problems. And I think everyone understands that we are a participant in the entire pipeline. And so once again, we're seeing slow progress. We have a much the majority of our candidates last year, our new board members, were persons of color. And we are continuing to build that, but we still probably have about 10% of people of color on our board, but they're having a big impact. And so it's a process. It's a process, but once again, we are all committed to it. The tickle cough, as bad as the acronym is, it's got a lot of vitality to it.
Mary?
Hi, I was just going to say diversity of thought. I think it's great everyone's got this effort of making people physically look diverse, but I think, Faye, you mentioned earlier about power on boards, and if a board represents a diversity of color, is there a diversity of thought and also maybe of power or of perspective that sometimes can be overlooked if we're thinking about just how people physically look on the outside? I don't know if that made much sense, but.
Well, I'm going to pick up on that, Mary, because Faye and I had a conversation with all our panelists, but we were talking about the arts, certain art forms, Christopher's museum more than Kevin's orchestra. Part of your mission is to provoke. And at what point, you're talking about diversity of thought, I mean, that's provoking is part of coming at things from a different direction. Where do you cross the line to offending? How do you, is it okay to offend, or is it okay only to merely provoke? And if offend is bad and provoke is okay, how do you make sure you don't cross the line? Or how do you have a balance? We talked about this, even if you don't remember.
Remember, I was sick.
Oh, that's right, you were feverishly ill. That's right.
I was
That's
sick.
a very good excuse.
What was I talking about?
Provocation.
Did I have an example?
No, you didn't. You didn't. Well, no, you actually, the way we got to it is you were talking about the role that the arts play in healing and helping people. We're talking about in the current social environment that the arts are a space for healing. The arts are a space for helping people find their way, and at the same time, they're a space for provoking people to think differently. And how do you navigate that and strike a balance? I think that's how we got there.
Got it.
And Kevin will
Kevin
speak
is-
even
yes.
if you don't.
Yes, I remember this now.
I just want to say that my experience with this, and it has more to do with the opera than with the orchestra, because we have so much of a greater opportunity in opera to provoke and offend people. Because, quite honestly, a musical interpretation is going to be fairly narrow, and you can offend people by choice of repertoire. We had a new work on our last weekend, and we got some, letters from folk who were terribly upset. But it's in the, being provoked or being offended is in the eyes of the offended and the provoked. And, so it's hard to say. But the one thing, and this gets back to scaffold again, one thing we learned at the opera is that we could do a lot of provocative things as long as the audience was prepared for it. And this really gets into the issue of if you want to get out of the box and be provocative, I don't know whether you want to offend people or not. You just sort of don't want to just say, oh, let's just be offensive because we're an arts organization. That really doesn't work. But to provoke really means that you want to engage them early on and let them understand what you're doing. And we found that, if we were doing something provocative and we communicated that to the audience, they were much more receptive and we got much less of a negative feedback, and it ended up being kind of a positive thing.
Thank you. All right. Roger Hale, a question from...
Roger Hale, been involved with Walker Board for about 50 years or so. I think
That's not an exaggeration, actually.
I think it's really important that in the arts to remember that the quality of art for art's sake, at the end of the day, is really important. And I think things can be extremely provocative or challenging or political, but if it isn't good art, and of course that's a matter of definition, but the Mapplethorpe photographs are a pretty good example, not the only example, but a good example of stuff that was very provocative and shocking in some cases, but extremely good art. And that was widely recognized. And I just think that everybody in the arts should keep that in mind. I can't stand, I'm very politically interested, but I can't stand seeing political stuff that is done poorly, where the acting is bad or the depiction, the artists are bad.
We have time for a couple of more questions. Over here, Cynthia, is it? Would you...
Joe, I found those statistics very impressive, and my follow-up question is, have you been able to track whether your audiences have become more diverse in the 2.5 years since you've made these great strides sort of on the staff and the performer part?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is we haven't counted. The other answer is anecdotally and observationally, we seem to be doing a bit better. I will say that if somebody told me today that we would have a 1% increase in diversity each year for the next 10 years, I'd sign immediately. I'd take it immediately. Because the fact is, as I'm given to understand it, even amongst our storied theaters of color in this town, culturally specific theaters, the majority of those audiences also are white. So the fact is, the folks who go to theater in the Twin Cities, and this is all of our issue, the folks who go to are mostly white. That's our reality. And so what we have to be careful of is the organizational tautology of, well, if all of our audience is white, why are we caring about all these other things because we're making work for white people? So, you end up in this endless loop. So we make the decision that we go first. We're changing what we're doing because we think white audiences also want to be conversant in the world, other cultures, other politics, things different than our own. And we expect that over time, the audience will change and develop to match our organization. But we make the decision that we have to go first, even if we know that the audience demographic change is taking the extremely long view. We can change what we're doing on the ground in the near term. The change of audience demographic is the long game, the really long game. Yeah.
Final question, if you
Yeah,
don't mind.
thank you.
And you are?
Liz Pangrel, I'm on the Board of Trustees with the Minneapolis Foundation.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's important, but I think that's important to me. The demographics of your audience will change when it becomes more affordable for our communities of color to attend these events. Several years ago, when the Walker had the Frida show, I worked on that project as a consultant. And one of the questions that came up to me, because I'm in marketing, was, geez, how do we get people of color to come to this show? And I said, you have to make it affordable, because most of our families have more than one child and they really want to come. You need to offer, which you do, the Walker does, but it's buried in your website, more affordable packages for families to become ongoing members. When I go to the Guthrie, I went last year almost to every performance, and I saw the same audience there practically every time. I was literally counting people of color, and I thought, there is a lack in outreach, there's a lack in connecting with our communities, our schools, the Somali, community, all of this. I don't know what's happening with outreach, but it doesn't seem to be there. And I know many people in the community who would love to go to the theater. They just can't afford it.
Yeah.
Except for the $20 deal, which
Well,
I do tell people a lot about, but
Yeah.
it's not affordable for our communities of color.
I'd like to respond to that. I think that's right, but I think also it's for us that would be ducking the issue. Frankly, I think financial barrier to entry is real. It's not the only barrier to entry. Our much larger barrier to entry is having an organization that doesn't feel like, for many communities, like they own it. And it is an organization that is built for the community that we are charged to serve. So I would say that the price point thing, that's real, but it's only one. And I would say on some levels, it's maybe second, third, or fourth on the list of things that have to be dealt with if we really want the audience that you are talking about. And this connects to the access question, if I can respond to that, and I'm sorry that to get back to that, to not have responded to it in the first place. We've got arrangements with 10 Title I schools where we have artists in residence all year long. We have every single 9th grader in Minneapolis public schools, every single one comes to the Shakespeare play every day at no cost to them. We're paying the tickets through our great partners, Project Success. We're taking that charge very seriously. We're all over those schools. On the 9th floor, every ticket for everything we do on that floor is $9. And we still see the same audience. So it's not that it's lower than the price of a movie ticket, and still we're not seeing these diverse audiences. So I take your point fully, but I'll say it's simply not the only barrier, and it may not be the principal one.
Christopher.
Access is super important, obviously, for all the arts groups, and Walker, 70% of the people that come to the Walker come for free, so overwhelmingly people are coming to see our product without paying anything. We still wish it could be more. We can't afford that quite yet. I honestly think one of the great things the Twin Cities community could do to make it possible for people to afford the arts and pay artists what they deserve to do to make the art they make is to close the really serious housing gap, education gap, income gap, employment gap. Those are things that are obviously way beyond the scope of what arts institutions can do, but to the extent our federal government, our state government, our county and city governments can really help uplift and help communities who have been discriminated against for decades have living wages and sustain families, then there's money to pay artists and do things. So I don't think it can only be us being free for everyone all the time, because someone's got to pay for that. The larger part, and obviously much more complicated, is how do we create a larger, more equitable society?
Wow, there's Well, as much as I'd like to keep this going, we need to wrap things up. And when we met up in the green room, I asked the panel, our objective was to be interesting, a little provocative, and entertaining. Hopefully we've been able to do that around a topic that obviously all these individuals, the organizations they run, feel is critically important. So do I. To your point, Mary, have always felt one of the central things the arts exist to do is to expose me and anyone who consumes the arts to difference in thought, difference in different ways of looking at the world, different experiences, and to move beyond simply being aware of those differences and tolerating those differences to ultimately celebrating those differences, because all the data shows that the most vital communities are diverse communities. And to me, that's what the arts going forward in Minnesota and Minneapolis can be all about. That's what they should be all about. That's what all of you as donors can help ensure they're all about. Thank you for being here this morning. Appreciate it.